One of the best aspects of Monster Hunter is the sheer variety of ways to play the game. This is all thanks to the various weapons and sheer amount of builds or sets that you can create. So I'm Darcblade with an Anti-Alatreon build for the Insect Glaive in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. Now the main purpose of an anti-build is to create a set that is made to counter a specific monster in the game. In this episode we're looking at countering Alatreon, providing hunters with two builds to take on the blazing black dragon, one safe, one a little bit risky. The Insect Glaive is quite an effective weapon to use against Alatreon. This is thanks to the fast attacks and long combos it has, meaning that it can really make use of elemental damage. So as a result it's able to easily power down Alatreon and finish the hunt quite effectively. So the first build is the risky Anti-Alatreon build. This build, much like all the risky builds in this little mini-series, makes use of the Safi'jiiva armor, providing us a ton of DPS options but at the cost of draining our health. So for this build you'll need the Safi Crested Crown Beta, the Safi Crested Chest Alpha, Fan Braces Beta, Belt Beta and Boots Beta. I'm also using a Fury Charm 5 and for my weapon I'm using the Kia Glaive King. This has a health regen augmentation and elemental up augmentation. As for the custom mods, I've gone for simply increasing the weapon's elemental rating, and when it comes to the specialist tools, these are down to personal preference. So when it comes to the jaws, you've got a fair few to play around with here. So first of all, I've gone for Blaze Jaw to max out the fire attack of this build. Of course, if you were using a different Kia weapon with a different element, you would replace the Blaze Jaws to match whatever new element you were using. I've then gone for Vitality Jaws for health boost, Tenderizer Jaws for weakness exploit, Expert Jaws for some critical eye, a Sharp Jaw for protective polish, a Evasion Jaw to max out evade window, and a Flight Jaw for the airborne skill. As for the jaws on the mantles, I've gone for Expert and Protection Jaws. So if you've done what I've done here, you should have a build with 150 health, 100 stamina, which will be 200 health and 150 stamina when you're on a hunt and taking all your relevant consumables. You have a raw attack of 918 with a little bit of white sharpness. You have 65% base affinity. This is taking into account the True Dragon Vein Awakening buff being in effect. This can easily be 100% as well when you're taking into account weakness exploit. You have a fire rating of 890. Again, this is taking into account the bonus provided by the True Dragon Vein Awakening. You have a Kinsect Sever boost bonus, and when it comes to your defense, you have a strong defense of 1101. That is strong against every element except for dragon. So when it comes to the skills, first of all, you'll have fire attack level 6. Fire attack increases the fire rating and damage of this build. Of course, if you were using a different weapon with a different element, you would replace fire attack to match whatever new element you were using. You have Resentment level 5, which is a very useful skill when using the Safi'jiiva armor set. Basically, every time you have a red portion of health on your health bar, it will give us increased raw attack, and as you should constantly have a piece of red health on your health bar thanks to the True Dragon Vein Awakening health drain, it means that this buff should be active for the majority of the hunt. You also have Evade Window level 5. Evade Window is a useful defensive skill that gives us increased invulnerability frames when we perform dodges. You have Health Boost level 3, allowing our health to get to that maximum of 200. Blight Resistance level 3, which allows us to ignore all elemental blights. Very useful against Alatreon, which means we also don't have to bring Nullberries onto the hunt. You have Critical Boost level 3. Critical Boost is a skill that increases our damage when our hits crit a monster. However, it only increases the raw attack portion of a hit, not the elemental portion. You have Weakness Exploit level 3. Weakness Exploit is a useful skill that increases our affinity when we're attacking monster weak points. And should these weak points be tenderized through Clutch Claw attacks first, then the Weakness Exploit affinity bonus is increased even more. Weakness Exploit at level 3 can potentially provide us an extra 50% affinity. Now, considering we also have 65% base affinity, Weakness Exploit at level 3 could be considered a little bit wasteful, but having the skill maxed out even with 65% base affinity, it means that we don't always have to prioritize tenderizing a monster's body part first. Anyway, your Critical Eye level 1, which can be level 3 when we're wearing our mantles, increasing the base affinity of this build. You have Airborne level 1, which increases the damage of our airborne attacks. Great for if you like to play the Insect Glaive in the air. You have Protective Polish level 1, which is a useful skill that allows us to put a protective coating over our sharpness gauge, preventing any sharpness loss for a small duration of time. This buff is applied after we sharpen our weapon. You have Critical Element level 1, which is like Critical Boost but for the elemental portion of our attack. So when our attacks crit a monster, we'll do increased elemental damage. And then finally, when you're wearing the mantles, you also have Divine Blessing level 2, which gives us a small chance at taking reduced damage when we take a hit from a monster. So that's it for the skills. Now for the set bonus, we only have one of them, which is the Safi'jiiva Seal, True Dragon Vein Awakening. This is a buff that kicks in whenever we have our weapon drawn. With our weapon drawn, it will give us increased base affinity up to 40%, as well as increased elemental rating. It would also give us increased element rating if we were using an element weapon, but that's not the case with this build. So we get a ton of buffs for simply having our weapon drawn, but there is a downside. With each swing of the weapon, it will drain our health, leaving a portion of red health on our health bar. This is taken advantage of with this build thanks to having resentment, but should this red health build up, it can leave us at risk of carting. But should we continuously attack a monster for a small duration of time, then the True Dragon Vein Awakening will initiate a small heal, healing us for the health it drained. So as you can see, this is where the risk factor comes in with this build. This is alleviated slightly with the health regen augmentation, but it's something you still have to be mindful of. But that's the risky Anti-Alatreon build I use for the Insect Glaive. But every build in Monster Hunter World has pros and cons. When it comes to the pros for this build, its biggest pro is its damage output, both in terms of elemental and raw. It can easily power down Alatreon and quite easily finish the hunt, so long as you're not getting hit. Which brings us on to the next pro, which is the quality of life skills that come with this build. Thanks to having Evade Window, Blight Resistance, Health Boost, Airborne and more, it all makes this build more effective and makes the hunts feel easier than they are. And the final pro is the True Dragon Vein Awakening buff itself, providing us a ton of DPS for simply having our weapon drawn. But of course there are cons to every build out there. The biggest con for this build is the True Dragon Vein Awakening health drain, which can leave us at risk. And although we have taken advantage of this by utilising resentment, it's still something you have to be mindful of. And the other con for this build is we only have a small portion of white sharpness, meaning that we're probably going to have to sharpen the weapon a few times during the hunt. This is alleviated slightly thanks to protective polish, but it's not completely eliminated. But regardless, this is a very strong DPS build to use against Alatreon when using the Insect Glaive. And thanks to the Insect Glaive's long combos and quick attacks, it means that you should easily be able to take on the Blazing Black Dragon. Which brings us on to the next build, which is the safe Anti-Alatreon build. This build is another strong elemental DPS build, but eliminates the health drain found on the risky Anti-Alatreon build and adds more quality of life. So for this build you'll need the Kaiser Crown Beta, the Brachydium Male Beta, the Kaiser Vambraces Beta, Kaiser Coil Beta and the Brachydium Grease Beta. I'm also using a Frost Charm 5 and for my weapon I'm using the Kiar Glaive Ice. This has a health regen augmentation, elemental up augmentation, and then for the custom upgrades I've gone for increasing the weapon's elemental rating. As for the specialist tools, again they're down to personal preference. So when it comes to the jaws, you've got a few to play around with, so I've gone for Resistor jaws for blight resistance, Expert jaws for critical eye, a Flight jaw for airborne, Vitality jaws for health boost, Challenger jaws to max out Agitator, a critical jaw to crit boost, and a Frost jaw to max out the ice attack. Of course, if you were using a different weapon with a different element, you would replace this Frost jaw as well as the Frost charm to match whatever new element you were using. As for the jaws on the mantles, I've gone for protection and expert jaws. So if you've done what I've done here, you should have a build with 150 health, 100 stamina, which will be 200 health and 150 stamina when you're on a hunt and taking all your relevant consumables. You'll have a raw attack of 893 with a decent chunk of white sharpness. You have 35% base affinity, which can be 100 when you're taking into account weakness exploit and the agitator buff being in effect. You'll also have an ice elemental rating of 700 with a Insect elemental boost bonus, and you'll have an OK defense of 1049 that is strong against fire, thunder and dragon, but unfortunately weak to water and ice. As for the skills, you'll have Agitator at level 7. Agitator is a skill that gives us increased raw attack and affinity whenever a monster becomes enraged. And as in Iceborne you can often control when a monster becomes enraged thanks to the whole flint shot mechanic, it means that this buff should be active for the majority of a hunt. You also have Ice Attack level 6, increasing the ice rating and damage of this build. Of course, if you were using a different weapon with a different element, you would replace Ice Attack to match whatever new element you were using. You have Critical Eye level 5, which can be level 7 when we're wearing our mantles. You have Health Boost level 3, Blight Resistance level 3, Weakness Exploit level 3, Blast Attack level 2. Blast Attack level 2 is a byproduct of the armor we're wearing. It's kind of wasted on this build, but because the armor that has this Blast Attack on has so many draw sockets and is needed for part of the set bonus, we kind of have to deal with it. Anyway, you have Heat Guard level 1, again another byproduct of the armor, but it's slightly more useful than Blast Attack. Heat Guard prevents any damage when we're in hot environments such as the lava zones in the Guiding Lands or Elder's Recess. You have Crit Boost level 1. It would have been nice to get this higher, but Crit Boost at level 1 still increases our overall DPS with this build. You have Airborne level 1, Latent Power level 1, again another byproduct, but Latent Power is a useful buff. It kicks in whenever you've been fighting a monster for a set amount of time or you've taken a certain amount of damage from that monster, providing us with increased affinity as well as reduced stamina consumption. and then you'll also have critical element level 1, and finally when you're wearing your mantle you'll also have divine blessing at level 2. Finally, for the set bonuses, you'll have 2 of them. First of all is Teostra's technique, Master's Touch, which prevents any sharpness loss when our hits crit a monster. And as we have a decent chunk of white sharpness, as well as being able to get to that 100% affinity, it means that we should see minimal sharpness loss with this build. And then finally, you'll have the Brachydios Wheel, Agitator's Secret, allowing the Agitator skill to get from level 5 to a maximum of level 7. So that is the safe Anti-Alatreon build. But even though it's safe, this does come with pros and cons as well. When it comes to the pros, the biggest pros is its damage output. Again, it's decent when it comes to both elemental and raw attack damage. It leans more to elemental damage than raw, but regardless, it's still able to easily power down Alatreon and finish the hunt. On top of that, this build has quite a few quality of life skills. Taking into account health boost, blight resistance, and airborne, again it makes the fight feel a little bit more easier than it is. And the final pro is that this build doesn't really have to worry about sharpness whatsoever. Thanks to having a decent chunk of white sharpness, up to 100% affinity, and Master's Touch, rarely should you have to sharpen the weapon during a hunt. But unfortunately, even this build has cons. The 2 major cons for this build kind of link into one another, the first being that it does rely on weakness exploit, as you need it to get to 100% affinity, and you also rely on the affinity bonus provided by Agitator as well. Without these 2, it means that we're going to see sharpness loss and have reduced damage thanks to crit boost and crit element not being in effect. But regardless, these are kind of minor cons, to be honest. This build is still very effective at taking on Alatreon, and is definitely recommended if you dislike having to manage your sharpness gauge and you don't want the health drain found on the risky Anti-Alatreon Insect Glaive build. So there we have it, those are 2 builds that I can recommend for taking on Alatreon with the Insect Glaive. Now of course, as you farm the monster more and more, you'll get Alatreon gear and weaponry, which have very high elemental ratings and defenses, allowing you to take on the hunt a little bit more easily. But until then, these builds will work just fine. So until next time, I've been Darcblade, bringing you Anti-Alatreon builds for the Insect Glaive in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.